So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Elina Ribakova with us from IIF. Hi, Elina.
Hello.
Elina will talk about the Russia sanctions, diving into the details. And we had some webinars before on the Russia sanctions and the war in Ukraine. And just to say a little bit, Sergei Goriev was talking more about the Russian macroeconomy. Then we had Jim Hamilton talking a lot about the oil shocks and what we can learn about the oil shocks we experienced earlier for the current events. And last week we had Bakai and Moll talking about the impact of a cold turkey embargo on Germany if you cut off gas and oil. Today we will focus much more on the details and also on the financial implications of the sanctions. So let me give a few opening remarks. Of course, there are different types of sanctions. There are trade sanctions. You can control export. So for example, certain technology products you don't export to Russia anymore. Or you can have import restrictions. That's in particular the energy restrictions. And you can have financial sanctions. Yes, financial sanctions can limit the activities you can take, so capital accounts controls. You can also freeze certain reserves, that's certain holdings, you freeze them. And you can also have some forced currency conversion. And you can, on top of it, with the financial sanctions and the trade sanctions, you can also target individuals. You can have travel restrictions and other forms of sanctions. Now, in order to have sanctions, you would like to have some resilience in your sanction scheme. So when you're offensive, you want to sustain the sanctions over the long time. They should not be just a short event, but also last for a long time to hold out for them. But if you're on the other side, like Russia, you have some resilience in order to be defensive. So you want to withstand other sanctions. And how do you do this? You can prepare for that before the sanctions are implemented. So build up reserves, you go for more autarky. And once the sanctions are implemented, you can be reacting to them. You're more agile, more flexible, and this way you can build up some more resilience. So there's essentially an offensive component to it and a defensive component to these sanctions. And on top of it, there are also secondary sanctions. What are secondary sanctions? Typically, what happens is at the moment, there's a lot of energy exported from Russia to Europe. And of course, there's a lot of energy coming from the Middle East or somewhere else exported to China. Now, if you just impose sanctions from Russian energy to Europe, you can just relocate the whole oil, for example. So essentially, instead of you cut off the oil exports from Russia to Europe, you just import from the Middle East. But instead, than Russia exporting to Europe, Russia is just exporting to China, and China doesn't need to import anymore from the Middle East. So this way, everything is as before. There's not a big change. So the sanctions don't have a big impact. They're not very costly for Europe because they get an alternative source, but they're also not very costly to Russia because they have another export market in China. And then the question is, do you want to impose some secondary sanctions on China if China is doing that? Or do you want to make it difficult to ship certain energy from Russia, across the globe, essentially to China, if there's no pipeline from Russia to China right now? So this way, you can actually avoid this way out typically you can have. Or it can also work with payments, so it makes it very difficult for China to pay for the oil from Russia. But in general, so oil is particularly the case where you can get around the sanctions, and the secondary sanctions necessary. For gas, you have this less the case because gas, you need pipelines in the first place, ideally in order to transport it. Now, in general, I think there's a hide and seek game going on. There's some questions which I think Elina will address. Why do they want to be paid in ruble? So they're instead of dollars or euros. And essentially, let the energy importers swap the currency from the euro into the ruble and then pay in rubles rather than paying in ruble, and then the Russian bank has to swap it. And there's probably a hide and seek game going on that you don't want that if the Russians have to do it, you see how they do it and how the paper trail is looking, and that you would like to figure this out. Another question we would like to address is, why doesn't Russia want to default on its dollar debt? Okay, and it's actually more the US who wants Russia to default on the Russian dollar debt, even though some of this debt is paid to the US banks. And there might be a reason that, if Russia is forced to default because they can't pay in dollars, then they might be downgraded already beforehand. That might not only hurt the current debt level, but it might also make it impossible, more difficult to raise debt in the future after the war is over. Because the existing debt becomes illiquid, but also the future debt is impaired because you have to first sort out the old debt issues. And then there's some issues to what extent crypto assets are used to get around sanctions, and we will go into that hopefully too. Now, let me just say a few words about sanctions and the international monetary system. So what the US did and the allies did essentially is to freeze the dollar reserves. And I've written a piece for VoxEU with Harold James and Jean-Pierre Landau. And the question is, what are the implications for the US dollar? And will the US dollar be hurt by having done that as a reserve currency? And there are some arguments out there which say, oh no, it will all move to crypto assets, to Bitcoin and Ethereum and others. Some others even argue, that the Australian dollar might step in, or commodities are stepping in and becoming a new reserve asset. We argue that's probably less the case because crypto is just not big enough and also not reliable enough. Same thing is for Australian dollars and commodities. It's very hard to transport in the first place. And then on top of it, the US is improving the store of value component of the US dollar by making it more digital and better this way. It's really the store of value component, not the invoicing and the immediate exchange aspect of the dollar. So the question is, what will then emerging economies do if there's no alternative out there for the US dollar? They might actually reduce the need to have reserves by just more actively intervening with imposing capital control. So this way you can either, if there's a run on your currency, you can have work with your reserves, and having high reserves might be a signal that there will not be a run in the first place, or you can alternatively, you can impose capital control. So there might be more activity on the capital control side going forward, and that might hurt globalization in a big scheme of things. So that might actually hurt the whole global economy because the globalization is going down. Now, with these little opening remarks, I would like to move to the poll questions Elina put forward. And there are three questions came up for. The first one is, does the ruble strengthening mean the sanctions are not working? Yes or no? And actually 20% said yes, and 80% said no. So it's actually still working according to the majority. We will see what the position is afterwards. The second question is, do you think that the full embargo is preferable to a gradual approach? Yes or no? And 60% saying yes, we should go full embargo right away. We shouldn't put it gradually and escalate down the road, but just go full force right away. So 60-40. Now, the next question is, I think, a very interesting one. Would you pay for sanctions on Russia or for a stronger EU armament? And how much of your annual income would you give up? And just to get a sense for that. And so what we have here in numbers, I should say that nobody was willing to give up 50% of the annual income. But to give up nothing, it's about 12%. 2% of the annual income is about 57%. And 5% are willing, or 5% income reduction as well, 20% are willing to do that. And 10% is about 9% of the people are willing to do that. So the majority, big majority is willing to give up 2%. And then, some are willing to, about 20% are willing to give up 5% of their income. But the extreme, giving up 25% or 50%, turns out it's very hard. There are very few people, one voter actually, each is willing to do that. So let me leave it at that and pass on the floor to, or the digital mic, to Elina, and she will tell us all about Russia and the sanctions and the details and the financial plumbing, what we need to know in order to really understand how things work in the Russia sanctions. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Markus, and thank you for the participants. And I see a lot of friends here also in the audience, so it will be a lovely discussion. It's an honor. As one friend said to me, so you've been invited to the Oscars? And I'm like, yes, I'm all ready. So I'm here at the Oscars. And of course, first and foremost, I do want to say thank you to our colleagues and friends in Ukraine for upholding our democracy and sovereignty in the European Union. I'm myself from Latvia, so I do feel strongly about that. And then, of course, I don't want to give too much agency to our Russian colleagues, but I also understand their predicament more than anybody else. So it's a multiple stab wound for many of the colleagues that have worked on this region for many years. So without further ado, I'm very happy with the answers to the question, and I will start with the sort of like from the third question, and then we'll go into the details. And the reason I want to bring up this third question here is because we have so gotten used to stay in our lane. So we have our macroeconomists, and we're like a tram. We stay in our tracks. Yes, there's some deviation, but we just sort of drive only this way. Then we'll have foreign policy experts who do their thing. We'll have national security experts. We'll have the defense experts. And we sort of all have existed relatively happily and separately up until recently. And I think that all started sort of changing just before the US-China standoff, when it became a bit more political, when we realized that, well, WTO, not everybody wants to sign up for that, and everybody has a little bit of grievances. Even multilateral organizations, we have some grievances around that. And of course, now with the conflict, with Russia's war in Ukraine, I think that highlights the concept of economic or national security even more so. However, and now let me start the presentation here with our Control L. Let me do the full screen. There we go. So as you can see here, it is all geopolitical now. And the issue is that we have the cost of sanctions versus sort of cost to ourselves versus the sanctioning of the economy we're trying to sanction. That is important, of course. And we have economic models to deal with that and try to think through that. But how do you compare cost of sanctions relative to military intervention? In terms of economics, in terms of a loss of life, because in a way, that's what we're discussing right now. And it's not only us. There is wonderful economic research on statecraft, not economic, but sort of mix of foreign policy and economics, on the geoeconomics and statecraft. There is Putin who says, well, this is an act of war. You're not sort of shooting bombs at us, but this is an act of war. There are also press talking about it. And even Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor before joining the administration, who also wrote that, wait a second, America needs a new economic philosophy. Foreign policy experts can help. So I think it's critical for us to have the models now, which will help us to think through the cost of sanctions and the details, not only within our field, but cross fields. And that is probably sort of, this is the highlight of the presentation and the question, the third question that we have here. So let's go further down and look at the next questions. Our sanctions are working, we do think that they are working, and I'll try to explain as much as I can what I have in this presentation. They're definitely having an impact. We have, as Markus pointed out, we have been sticking to financial sanctions mostly in terms of Russia since 2014. We had plenty of time to practice. We had plenty of time to think through. The number of times we wrote about sort of sovereign debt sanctions on Russia, it's hard to count, but we're almost not even thinking about that because we have put all the most severe financial sanctions, almost all of them, on the table now very quickly in the extraordinary coordinated fashion or almost over the weekend. So I think there's definitely a big achievement for the US, for the EU, for countries to sort of stepping out of their usual rhythm and being able to coordinate internationally very severe financial sanctions. But we've been mostly focusing on financial sanctions. Yes, some of them have de facto become a little bit trade sanctions, and we can talk a little bit more about that, about SWIFT and other payments issues. Yes, there have been some export controls, and the European Union has also stepped into that. But we have not yet touched the crown jewel of Russia, the most important part, which is commodity exports. And so the question is here, is it time to move to smart sanctions on energy? Then I don't want to say I wouldn't want to advocate for any way or the other, but I do feel that given the nuance and the complexity of moving away from Russia's energy, and what also Markus sets the stage in terms of the diversion of Russian energy, it's important to get it right and have an enduring impact rather than to go cold turkey, realize by the winter that we don't have important energy sources, that the refineries cannot work, that we cannot supply Ukraine with diesel, and then have to back away and somehow start renegotiating the position. I think that would be for all the most possibly awful scenario. So talking about smart sanctions, what could be done? Already now, we could look into escrow accounts for payments for Russia's exports. And again, it can be oil, it can be gas, it can be other exports. Russia would still receive those payments, but Russia would be limited in terms of what they can spend on. And here we can talk a little bit, what does it mean? What are the objectives of sanctions? And the objectives of sanctions can be numerous. And as I started, it can be sort of within the macroeconomic field, but oftentimes it's actually within the foreign policy and military fields, right? But the most narrow definition of sort of objective, we want to impose harm on the other party's economy, or we wanted to make more costly for them to finance the war, or nearly impossible to finance the war. So those kind of objectives within our macroeconomic field, we can try to achieve. If we start talking more about regime changes, frankly, we almost don't even have models to assess that. And then empirical evidence, I haven't seen almost any papers that will conclusively say that this kind of sanctions can work, and they have worked in the past. And definitely in terms of macroeconomic research, this is a fascinating field. But in terms of limiting Russia's ability to finance the war, imposing cost on Russia's economy, we have been successful, and we can do more. So escrow account for payments on Russia's exports, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Limitations, of course, on oil and gas purchases. US has already made an announcement on oil embargo. There are refineries in the US will not be able to work anymore. They still have some supplies that will be able to work through that, but they will have issues because Russia's oil is similar to Venezuela, it's similar to Canada, but Venezuela is a tricky relationship, and Canada, again, there are infrastructure issues. But so it will be a cost, but of course it's not the same cost that the European Union would have to go through if they were to start doing this embargo. Therefore, it's natural that the US, it's easier for them to do this. For Europe, it requires more time and preparation. And again, let us not forget, we have worked with financial sanctions on Russia very closely since 2014. We have not really developed the tools or the analysis to work on the energy sanctions on Russia. Actually, frankly, very few people worked on this issue and seriously started considering it only recently. So it's natural that unintended consequences could be there, and it's important to work through them. And then finally, the question of diversion. So I'm giving you all the upfront, and then we'll go into details. The question of the diversion, as you saw Yelen's presentation at the Atlantic Council, she sent a very straight, clear arrow message towards India and China that secondary sanctions are on the table. And generally, what this Markus explained about secondary sanctions, US has been using secondary sanctions effectively and frequently. European Union will have to keep quiet on this because generally European Commission considers secondary sanctions to be not illegal. And one of the recent tools that they have developed to defend themselves against economic coercion is specifically aimed actually at the secondary sanctions. So it will be very interesting. But if it will be working in coordination with the EU saying that, look, we're also going to take measures to reduce our reliance on Russian energy, then the US can more freely, without endangering transatlantic relationship, can focus also on the secondary sanctions threat to China and India. How can that work? Well, it has worked in the past. It's been done with Iran. What happens in order not to shock the commodity markets immediately, cold turkey, and have potentially a very high price from which actually Russia benefits and almost neutralizes the effect that we're trying to achieve. You would give waivers 6 months, say, from now, or a year from now. In the Iran case, I think it was 6 months, where you say if the countries commit to a certain reduction, you're going to grant waiver down the road for them to continue importing what they need. And this way, you're withdrawing sort of this the supply of commodity from the market gradually, but at the same time, you're working with the partners on the other side. But then at the same time, you're achieving the objective that you need, meaning that, say, in that case, in case of Iran, China and India were forced to reduce their purchases, and actually they did that. So let's move to the next slide. We talked a lot with Markus also before the seminar and other colleagues. So sort of what is Russia really? Like, explain me Russia in one chart. And this is chart I've drew many times over my career. And this is just for all of us who know very well, this is the flow of funds. This is the balance of payments. Very simplified version of the balance of payments. The red one is current account balance surplus. And generally, as you can see, Russia is in surplus. Why? Because Russia exports commodities mostly. And then, of course, when there is a shock to commodities, Russian domestic demand tends to contract, the imports contract as well. And then the current account rarely goes into deficit. So what has happened from, say, 2011 and even sort of similar picture before until 2014? We see a lot of stuff happening on the capital account as well. So there's this green bars, there are this gray bars, there is FDI, there is a blue bar, the FDI. So Russia seems to be very engaged in the global economy, not just from the current account perspective, but also from the capital financial perspective. It's very sort of engaged, it's incorporated in the global capital flows. In terms of the, oh, sorry, there's one. The yellow, the green bar is Russia's borrowing on the external capital market. Sorry about this. This is the, yes, this is the Russia's borrowing on the external market. Oh, I'm sorry, the one sort of, it's a little bit dropped off, but never mind. So I'll walk you through that. So the green one is Russia's borrowing on the external market. The blue one is FDI. Red is current account, and gray is mostly junk. It's mostly Russia's sort of capital flight or Russian residents leaving money from Russia. So we talked about current account. We have this integration in the global capital markets, but what Russians do with that, they put money outside. It can be some of the export proceeds that Russia decides not to sell domestically into the local market. It can be some of the borrowing, then that gets into this sort of round tripping. And I know colleagues have done very good work on the China similar situation, on the issues with the balance of payments. But long story short, there is a lot of integration. What happens after 2014? After 2014, you see the rupture. So you see these green bars shifting to negative. So Russia aggressively repaying external debt, Russia disentangling from the global capital markets. FDI also has second thoughts. FDI also starts going away. And also as Russian resources likely shrink, that's why there is less money for capital flight. So we have that situation. Russian authorities think about it and say, wait a second, we're not liking this situation too much. We would like to rebuild our buffers. And they start rebuilding reserves. They do fiscal adjustment, and they focus on positive real rates and inflation targeting. And we're going to look at that in a second. So we will look through that more closely. What is happening most recently now? We're enjoying very high current account surpluses, and at the same time, we're seeing also some outflows. So I'm very curious now, the latest data we have for the first quarter of this year, it's only for current account and reserves. But of course, I'm also very curious how effective the authorities will be with their capital controls containing this capital account outflows. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. So yes, we talked through the, through the sanctions that they have been taken. And let's move a little bit more into the nuance on the financial sector sanctions. Just a reminder to all who don't look at Russia very closely all the time, Russia's financial system is dominated by state-controlled banks. So if we go down the list, Sberbank is state-controlled, VTB, Gazprom, there is Rosselselsbank, there is Открытие as well now. So there is almost all the top banks are state-controlled. And just Sberbank, the top largest bank, is a very significant share of total banking system assets. It's also a very significant share of deposits, and it has branches across the country, and it's also banks, a lot of even pensioners. So it's a very important, sort of socially important bank. The largest private bank, which was recently sanctioned, is Alpha Bank, and it's 5%. It's very small share of the total banking system assets. And then all the foreign banks, as you can see, and that's when we're not even talking about that kind of exposure, all the foreign banks are less than 10 percentage points of total banking system assets. So it's a heavily dominated state-controlled financial system. It sort of operates as if it were independent banks, but of course, in a situation like this, government has a lot of control over the financial system. So in addition to freezing assets of the Russian central bank, as Markus pointed out in his note, what else has happened in terms of the financial system? We have put a number of banks on the blocking sanctions or blocking sanctions or other type of limitations. The most important one is Sberbank. Sberbank was first disconnected from the corresponding banking with the US. And what that really effectively means that Sberbank cannot touch dollars. So when it was recently added to the full blocking sanction, it didn't make a significant change because it already couldn't touch dollars and it was already disconnected from this global financial behemoth dominating the markets, US markets and US dollar. Sberbank has to work with euros. Why was Sberbank spared, just like some other bank, like Gazprom Bank? Because European colleagues continue to buy energy from Russia and they need to find a way to pay for that energy. If we're going to sanction all Russian banks to full blocking sanctions, whether it's, even if it were the US only, European counterparties would not be able to work with those banks. And this is where, sort of the threat of secondary sanctions comes in. If Europeans would like to continue to transact in euros with these banks, it will still be difficult and potentially sanctionable activity if that sort of feeds back to the US. So that's why a lot of these banks have been still spared until recently, so that Europe can continue and still continues to pay for Russian gas and other commodities.
Can you say a little bit about the difference across the banks? They're all state-owned enterprise except for the Alpha Bank. Some are red, some are blue.
Yes, so the red one brings me to SWIFT.
Is different than the Sberbank, for example, because it has Gazprom and has an energy arm already part of it?
Absolutely. So Sberbank is mostly one of the sort of, I wanted to give up the American example, but I'll resist. So the Sberbank is your sort of savings bank. It's the largest domestic savings bank that it's mostly for local population. I think also that's why the US was trying to stay away from Sberbank in the beginning, trying to signal to common Russian people that we're not after you. Of course, we're now past that point. VTB was Russia's investment banking idea. That died a very quick death because once it was added to full blocking sanctions, it had to send a letter to all its clients saying that we're moving all our brokerage accounts to somebody else. We can no longer do that. VTB is also a little bit of a piggy bank where the government of Russia, if they need support during a crisis, they can call the head of the VTB and say, you know what, you have to bail out these firms. Traditionally, it was not done to Sberbank precisely because they're worried about the bank runs and individual babushkas and dedushkas in the villages losing their deposits, so they try not to mess with that bank. And that bank actually did a lot of progress, Sberbank, in terms of being more progressive and digital and all that. Let's not get
the
there.
bank runs we observed were mostly with Sberbank?
The bank runs we observed were with everybody, but particularly including with Sberbank, which is usually the bank that doesn't get run on. So it gets a little bit of a spillover, but the fact that you had runs with Sberbank, like at their cash machines, at their branches, I think that is very significant and shows you that you really had a widespread crisis in Russia. Okay. And then other banks, as you point out, the Gazprom is another key bank here, is the one that works mostly with Gazprom. It mostly works with energy. It's also an active bank, but it's it's focused on the commodities and energy. And there are other banks that some of them maybe work more with military or that got disconnected. And then the red ones are the ones that were disconnected from SWIFT. So SWIFT is where we got a little bit into the territory from the financial sanctions into trade sanctions, even before the actual trade export embargoes and others were taken. Why? Because as we know very well, SWIFT is a multilateral international cooperative of, I think, more than 11,000 institutions that processes millions of transactions a day. But what they do, they don't settle. You know, Russia has domestic payment system, US has domestic payment system. Many countries will use SWIFT for exchange of transactions. So what you do is that you send the information. All of us, whenever we have to send to grandma the payment, you know, we say, oh, correspondent bank this, you know, IBAN this and that. So we fill it out, and this way, this payment is not lost. So settlement happens separately, but there is information going alongside it where we all know what's happening in those payments. There is no alternative at the moment to SWIFT. And I think when we talk about the dollar alternatives, it's also important to start talking about the payments alternatives. So for example, if there, and I'm diverting just for a second, if there were a fantastic payment system, the new blockchain system or CBDC system based on European currency, ECB, it could potentially be a competitor to the dollar as well. Because as we know, we use money for many purposes. One of them is for payments, right? For speed and effective payments. And SWIFT has been dominating, it's been a monopoly on this payments information services. And now with the new blockchain developments and CBDCs, it potentially will have competition. So by this,
the argument that you can replace SWIFT with sending faxes. So of course you can't handle the volume, but for your energy payments, you could make the payments through sending a fax and replace.
We can, yes. Markus, I'm sending you a fax now. It's going to arrive. I'm going to buy. I mean, yes, of course you can, right? I mean, but it's practically is very difficult. And I think one of the sort of issues, apart from self-sanctions by firms, in the immediate issue that hit is this SWIFT. Once they're disconnected from SWIFT and you had accounts with those banks and you tended to use them for your trade payments with Russia, you had to stop, because wait a second, I'm going to set up a different account in a different bank. Which bank might be the next one sanctioned? Then it's impractical for most people to work. But yes, for energy payments.
How easy can you get around it if I just say, okay, I can't do it with VTB bank anymore, I go to Gazprom bank?
Yes, you have to set up just a different account. In that sense, it is easy. You have to migrate all your accounts, all your documentation to a new place. They will know your client, you will do all treasury risk assessments, and then you move to that, yes. And if you were to exclude, for example, energy payments from you exclude the bank from SWIFT, but you still want to do energy payments, in theory, you could still do it, because energy payments, as opposed to little things, are pretty bulky. So it's relatively easier to trace them in the pile of payments information. But even then, there is a whole conversation about the need for new technology for better accuracy of SWIFT transfers. So this is what we've had since 2014 till now. Oh, there we go. So we don't have to spend too much time here. The chart on the left is the same what I said before, disengagement from the global financial system. And this is, from 700 billion outstanding gross debt of Russian Federation to about 200. This is more than, it was 750 actually. So this is a large reduction in external debt, all of it repaid, and this is the result of 2014 sanctions. So this is also what happened to reserves. And let's go to the next one. This was Russia's natural response to 2014, said, okay, fine, you're hitting me with sanctions, as we started at the beginning of the seminar. I'm going to insulate myself and isolate myself from you. I'm going to accumulate enough reserves so I can withstand an external shock. My current account surpluses will continue because you need to continue buying my energy, but on the capital account, I'm kind of disengaged. And that is where the start of the presentation, the first chart. And this is what they did. They accumulated reserves. They also thought a little bit about
the gold. Is this physical gold?
Physical gold, yes. It's
and
physical
you can
gold.
Ship it? I mean,
it's easy because they are one of the largest producers. So they have domestic companies that produce gold, and they can get it from them.
I see.
So that's why it sort of worked nicely for them. And this is what happened exactly from March 2014 to 2021. We have shift away from the dollar, massive, right? We have shift away towards gold onshore. Physically, it's also present onshore. We're moving a little bit more to yen. Well, significantly more relative to the dollar. It surpasses, right? And this is data from end 2021. And look at it carefully, because this is the last time you see it. They're going to stop publishing breakdown, understandably, as well as probably many other things they'll stop publishing now. So our job will get more interesting. They also divest from US treasuries because they felt that this, in sort of spirit of financial sanctions, again, that will be the easiest for US to sanction, right? So there have been some stories about maybe them hiding it in Bermuda, Bahamas, or whatever it is. But official statistics, this is the official statistics.
So are you saying that they were preparing already for almost 10 years for this war?
Whether, like you're asking me, like ex-post, we're smart. I do not know if they've been preparing for the war, but they have been isolating themselves, and they've been thinking geopolitically about their macroeconomics since 2014, 100%. And that's why you could have independent, super professional, a macroeconomic bloc, and let them work and do their job, because their objectives aligned with the objectives of the geopolitics. And what did they do since 2014? Isolation, super strong macro, cut fiscal deficits, attract foreign investors to support your ruble and your fiscal with high real rates, which aligns with domestic inflation targeting and higher demand, higher supply of domestic ruble funding. And in the meantime, you try to cut fiscal deficits, so eventually you can even say to foreigners goodbye. So by the time the war started, they were at the stage they could have said to foreigners goodbye. We do not need foreigners at all to finance our budget. So yes, they've been preparing for something. Whether it was for war, it's hard to say. So, but all that said and done, did sanctions have an impact? Well, sanctions all put together by a lot of countries, all the nuclear financial sector sanctions at the same time, I think they're going to have an impact. We're seeing some evidence of Russia's imports already contracting. We're seeing some evidence of economic activity decelerating. We need to watch second quarter. So I think any indications from and soon enough, actually, give it a couple of quarters, we'll be watching the lights in Russia from satellite imagery. I think that will be very interesting if we stop getting any statistics, hopefully not so fast. But yes, sanctions had an effect. Sanctions are likely to have an effect on growth. And one of the reasons they're going to have such a dramatic effect is because there was a shock to the financial industry, but also there is a shock to production because Russia relies a lot on imported components. And we can talk a little bit about that later, but let's start sort of stay with the financial sector. As you can see, we can look at on the right-hand side, we can do financial conditions index, but in Russia, I think policy rate matters. So there was a very professional and swift response from the central bank. The central bank hiked rates by more than double the rate, and also took extensive capital controls measures. And the capital controls measures of what they did is the export proceeds requirement. 80% of all exporters' monies that they get in foreign exchange needs to be converted into the market and into ruble. And it has to happen quickly. And I think they're probably looking after it closely. Individuals cannot withdraw more than $10,000 from their accounts until September. I think they recently started changing it, but then basically it's a freezing of your foreign exchange deposits, right? There is also limited convertibility. You cannot buy more than $10,000 into foreign exchange. Some of that is being relaxed, but these were the immediate measures announced, and they definitely had an effect. So let's look here. What's happening to the ruble? Ruble is back to pre-crisis levels. Why is ruble back to pre-crisis levels? Huge current account surpluses and tight capital controls and highly skilled response by the central bank. So that's why ruble is back to the pre-crisis level. Also, let's not forget, there is not much liquidity. So if me or you would try to transfer a proper trade size transaction through the ruble, it would be difficult. And I do not know if it's absolutely true, but anecdotal evidence, I heard even that Russian exporters were struggling to sell dollars on the market because there were not enough buyers. So that's given that all foreign investors were taken out from the ruble market by a lot of the measures, by a lot of the capital control measures.
So just to get a sense, so you're saying the ruble is back, but it's a different ruble because I can't use it essentially. I have to keep it in Russia.
Exactly. It's ruble is back because it's a heavily capital controlled ruble. But the current account inflows are real.
And this 80-20 rule, so does it hurt the oligarchs as well? Or is it mostly that anyways, everything is state controlled and the oligarchs are not really engaged in that?
Exactly. I think this is another step of the preparation from the 90s or 2000s when Putin came to power, is removal of oligarchs from almost all spheres, leaving them very small controlled areas, whether it's metals and mining a little bit in gas, very little, then in telco, media, maybe not so much anymore, but no, media, no, sort of consumer services. So we pushed them out into more neutral territories, but the core crown jewel, oil and gas, is with the state. Banking system is with the state. So it's a very state-controlled enterprise, Russia. So therefore, the money is mostly flowing to the state.
About rare earth, have you looked into rare earth as well? Is this controlled by oligarchs or by the state as well? And is this of any relevance, or is it too small to matter?
It's well, I have looked less about it. I think yes, I'm going to skip this question for now.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the banking system, and then we can go over this quickly. So the bank runs. You asked me about the question about the bank runs. So this is structural liquidity surplus of the banking system was vis-a-vis Russia. And I generally do think that it has something to do with the fact that the system would get more deposits than it finds lending opportunities. I do not think it's a problem with Russian payment system that requires you to hold such buffer on your overnight account with the central bank. So this is basically money that the treasuries of various banks have to park with the central bank because they don't have any use for it. It just sort of balances hanging over there. So we've had a long history when Russian system has been in surplus. And to me, it means again that there are not enough lending opportunities. What happened in this, you see from the February 28th, there is a sharp drop and it's a very significant drop. So to me, that signals that a lot of banks are experiencing such bank runs that they have to turn to the central bank and borrow. And this is also what we're seeing in the close-up of the same. We're not going to get into it. Russia has made fantastic, no longer relevant, but fantastic progress in monetary operations, different instruments. They can lend to you in foreign exchange. They can lend you with non-market-based collateral. There are a lot of things. So, but long story short, they lend a lot. I do find it interesting that there are some banks that are still in surplus. Of course, it's normal during the crisis, your system becomes fragmented. I wonder if it may be foreign banks, because if, or Sberbank didn't have such big runs as I'm thinking, but I do think they did. So this is something that can be studied further. So we talked through most of this, I think. And so I do get a lot of questions, sort of how is the money coming now and what the Russian request is for rubles, for payments in rubles. So if we talked about financial sanctions, we've done a lot of financial sanctions on Russia. Yes, they had some impact. System is stabilizing. What's next? We're asking ourselves this question. Russian authorities are not silly. They're also asking themselves the same question. So they do understand that next is potentially further oil and gas embargoes. And if you might remember, the announcement on the ruble payments came around the time when I think Biden was going or was already going in Europe, when there was some noise that Europe might take more aggressive steps on the energy. And that's when suddenly this measure came from Kremlin. And then the authorities were told to explain how exactly this measure will work. And the central bank had to struggle a little bit to figure it out. So I do think it was out of fear, and it was a preemptive measure against potentially further sanctions on Russia, including maybe this escrow account that we discussed, or other sort of embargo measures. So what happens with the ruble? It's actually very straightforward. We have Gazprom Bank, and we have regulation from the we have regulation from the central bank that explains that. So you, as a buyer, any buyer in Europe, and there are many companies buying from Europe. It's not that Europe buys centrally. They have lots of companies that buy from Gazprom gas. So they have to open the special account with Gazprom Bank. Then they will have to pay into that account in euros. Gazprom Bank will then convert their monies into rubles. It doesn't have to go to the central bank for that. And I think we can talk a little bit more about this and what it means for sanctions and today's news. But it doesn't, the way I understand it, doesn't have to go to central bank. It can go to the market, convert it into rubles, and then again, put it on the buyer's account. The buyer opened FX account, brought the monies, Gazprom converts it into rubles, and then the rubles are being paid for Gazprom by Gazprom Bank. So it's a very simple quote unquote transaction. Gazprom Bank is not sanctioned that in a way that prevents them to do this activity. If Russia can coerce enough foreign buyers to do this transaction, it will become very difficult to sanction Gazprom Bank. If we do transactions in ruble and Gazprom Bank has hold of your euro account, it's much harder to do escrow account for oil for food style. So I do think that, maybe it's not a wonderfully thought through idea, but it's sort of some ways of trying to prevent from getting more into the energy sanctions.
I want to come back to my earlier question. Is then the SWIFT sanction, is this having any bite if I just can always go through Gazprom Bank? Or it has... In
that sense, no, exactly. It had an original bite, but I think sanctions are a moving target. You bite it here, it moves, you have to bite it again. So yeah. I don't think that sanctions can be seen as that you shoot it once, you shoot one weapon and then you can relax, right? I think it's systems adapt. And I think what we learned from 2014, Russia did an amazing job of adapting to 14 sanctions, especially even in terms of macro improvements. They did inflation targeting and fiscal rule out of spite to sanctions. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they're in a much more vulnerable position now. But again, the system will adapt. The accounts will migrate to banks that are not sanctioned, the banks that are not under SWIFT. It will become even more centralized SOE-owned financial system, but we are past that in Russia.
So let me just, if China buys some oil from Russia, how's the payment happening then?
There have been some talk about payments in yuan and some talk about payments in rubles. Generally, I think it is still used to pay for oil, and most oil and gas is actually still, a big chunk of it is still traded in dollars, oil particularly. because there are no benchmarks for oil in euro. So then it makes the whole process much more cumbersome. Then for gas, there have been some sort of discussions, and I think there are small, so I know it more from the news than the actual data, that some payments do happen in rubles and yuan. And we also know from the news that India is agreeing to pay something in rubles.
But if it happens in dollars, the US can observe the amount
Yes.
of payments.
Yes.
And everything is
If
observed.
it happens in dollars, if it happens via SWIFT, US from the 2011 onwards has an agreement where this is all the transactions of SWIFT, can request that. So then US has full visibility.
And does the Russian state have some offshore accounts somewhere, outside of Russia, and you can pay to them? Or we don't know.
We do not know. I think we definitely, but again, Russian state versus SOEs. SOEs definitely do. And at this stage, SOEs and Russian states are becoming much more one. And as we saw, this big gray area, the dodgy area, it's been huge for years. Russian capital account outflows have been 100 billion, 70 billion every year. And we try to do a few times research on trying to break it out. What does it link to? Doesn't? There's always a big chunk that is just pure capital flight.
And this pure capital flight comes from whom? The oligarchs or other parts of there?
Most likely from the oligarchs or, most likely from the oligarchs or SOE companies.
Okay.
So, for example, there is a nice, I think, research on 2014 sharp sell-off of the ruble. I do recommend for many to read, where it's alleged, looking at the one-by-one sort of tick-by-tick data, that one of the large SOE companies wanted to convert very big amount in the middle of the illiquid market, and that's what moved the ruble. So things like this do happen.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so very important today, EU said that this kind of scheme of transferring payments potentially is against the sanctions. So we'll see an interesting debate, and Hungary at the same time said that they're going to comply with the scheme and buy. So I think European sort of fragmentation here is very, very important. If Russia manages to fragment Europe on this topic, it will make this progress on sanctions even more cumbersome.
So if Europe just agreed, or they're about to agree to buy all the gas centrally through one central agency, that would make a big difference.
Yes, that will definitely strengthen their negotiation power, and also would remove this fragmented power problem of Europe. So we talked about the current accounts. We don't have to spend much time. Just a quick reminder on the right. So for Russia, crude oil, petroleum products are also important, and of course, natural gas. So we do talk a lot about natural gas, but oil is still the biggest share, and petroleum products as well. And petroleum products is somewhere where we might be able to start with limitations and embargoes, because then it would also benefit some of the refineries in Europe. They will say, thank you very much. We don't want your products. We're very happy to get rid of them. We're happy to comply. We'll be able to have better production ourselves. And chances are they will have enough capacity to do that. So that's another,
Petroleum products are refined gas or refined diesel?
Oil, mostly, this is all the products that come from oil.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's go quickly to the next. We know the largest, the largest partners that we know it is Europe. And so if we look at who are the largest buyers of oil and gas, of course, is EU, UK, and the US. And this is the right-hand side chart. So they buy the bulk of what Russia exports. So especially for oil and petroleum products, the dark, sort of the dark line, the black line is, they account for the bulk of what Russia exports. And the similar story is for gas as well. Let's maybe move on quickly. There is also data here on which countries are how they're more exposed. And so what we see is that sort of the gas supply, of course, as we know very well, is much less diversified, right? So the share of energy imports accounted for Russia in gas here is much more significant than it is in oil. So we do have more room for maneuver in oil rather than in gas. And gas, very quickly, we do have also the physical limitation capacity. We have LNG terminals in a number of countries, but they're not in the right places. So bringing enough from the various LNG terminals to the north sort of north of Europe is tricky. So for example, Spain has a lot of capacity, but there is only one pipe that's going to France, and there is nowhere near to be able to substitute Russia. Spain could buy less gas maybe from Algeria, and then Italy could pick it up. There's also the sort of the other opportunities, but generally fully it's not possible at the moment and the near term, because you need to think how you build infrastructure here. It's not the question that we can sort of we have the capacity, let's bring it in. We need to have infrastructure in the middle of the country. That infrastructure will take time to build. Of course, there is also a chance of maybe scaling down demand for gas. That should contribute, but that will be needed anyway, even sort of with improved infrastructure.
So can I ask you directly, so would you go call Turkey and say we cut off Germany from gas right away, and that would be most effective, or would you say we need to wait?
I worry that if we sort of an extreme scenario, you cut off Germany, you can do probably more or less now because it's warmer, but I do worry that come 1 year or maybe 2 years, and we do not know how this conflict is going to develop. And if there is maybe a change in government, and maybe there is huge social pressure to reconnect to some sort of gas supply come winter, and you have, especially Austria, but Germany too, you have people not having enough heating. You have to ration heating.
And can you say a little bit about Central Europe, like Poland and all this? They're even more dependent on Russian gas, I guess.
So yes, we have here, we have countries that are even more dependent, and that's why Hungary, as you can see, share of energy imports accounted for by Russia for gas, for Hungary is up here. That's why it's happy to comply. You know, we have other countries here in a very tricky situation. So yes, they're very dependent. Of course, for them, the question that we asked on the poll, how much you would pay for the war versus gas, that's it's there more in this outlier part of your question, because there is a genuine concern in the Baltics about risk of invasion. Okay. And of course, Germany is here, close to the EU average. So therefore, as we discussed earlier, I would rather start with oil. I would go after oil products, petroleum products. I would look at the taxes or other sort of embargo versions on oil itself, but gradually. And then in the meantime, build infrastructure and smart contracts within the gas infrastructure, LNG, and another sort of reduction in demand, and then implement the gas part of the story somewhat later. So, and which also brings us to the next natural point, which is what is more, we want to have less cost to us and more cost to Russia. So where is more cost? Well, more cost is in oil and petroleum products. Of course, with extremely high gas prices, that might start changing. But even then, here you have the oil for the balance of payments. This is red oil, blue, sorry, vice versa. This is red gas, blue is oil and petroleum products. This is the bulk of an inflows that we're seeing. Just very quickly on gas, so we can talk about it later, the spot versus the long-term contracts for gas. I think that's another important issue, but maybe we come back to that.
So you would cut off the oil, but at the same time, you're not worried that the oil is just shipped to some other countries in China?
That's a very good point.
Shipping, or?
Hold on a second. Let me just do that since you asked for it. We might not be able to get through all the presentation here, but everybody will have it as a chart pack. Okay. So, Druzhba pipeline, 1964. The energy experts here might correct me. This is Druzhba pipeline. Druzhba is friendship. 1964. Lovely. I mean, I like Soviet art, so I do collect some of that stuff. So anyway, so this is Russia's a lot of Russian oil, and there is a pipeline that goes here. There are some transportation hubs that go here as well. There is one pipeline that started going towards China, and it was completed not long ago, and it's also going to another transportation hub here to China, but it's the same pipeline. So for Russia, the biggest reserves are still closer to Europe, and the infrastructure is still closer to Europe. To divert via the pipeline, so if we look very quickly at Russian crude oil exports in 2020, in million tons, we have Russia, you have Europe, you have China, and you have other. And I'm not even breaking out India because it's just too small. So we have the pipeline, and this is Economist calculations about pipelines. So I'm not going to talk about the maintenance, and like I'm sure some energy expert will say that this is very wrong, but let's bear with me. This is the official pipeline. So we have the pipeline, and this is sort of currently used by the pipeline. So we want to take and replace some of Europe. What we can replace this much. So 42% of exports to Europe via pipeline to China. This is just simple calculations. How are you going to replace the rest? How are you going to replace the rest? You can try it via cargo, sort of trains domestically. You can try via shipments around the world. You can wait until it melts here more and you go more, right? So, but it will be cumbersome and difficult, and it gives also opportunity.
The ships?
Sorry, yes, the ships is possibility, but you end up using a big share of global available ships for that. And here you would also need insurance companies who would be willing to work with you despite the threat of sanctions.
So let me ask you, one puzzle thing is Ukraine. Some of these pipelines go through the Ukraine. They could stop at these particular pipelines, I guess.
Yes, but they haven't. They haven't stopped neither gas, neither have bombed them. They it's very peculiar situation. The trade is still ongoing. The gas is still ongoing. Ukraine gets Russian oil indirectly for the military effort. So it's yes, they could do that, but they haven't gotten to that point yet.
So you think it's in the Ukraine's interest to keep it going in order to have enough diesel in order to fight the war?
Yes, at the moment, yes, they're for sure. So they do get their diesel from Poland, and Poland gets it from Druzhba pipeline. So and diesel is critical during the war. So yes, for Ukraine itself, Ukraine is the first one to ask quietly for nuance, not a cold turkey approach.
Oh, really? Can you say this again?
Well, I mean, I think the question is, Zelensky made a very big statement the other day about the cold turkey approach, actually, and it's very important for media. But I think it's also sort of many people in Ukraine also understand that it has to be a smart sanction. Mm-hmm. So the cold turkey, what can be done is escrow accounts can be done. That is something that nobody has to wait for. Targeting realistic cutoff of oil and gas, it's also something that can be done, but not saying from today to tomorrow we're going to stop buying everything else. The question on the stop buying everything else, and here I'm answering now you out of my field. If we're thinking about now economic statecraft versus military versus nuclear war versus the cost of lives in Ukraine, then yes, then of course keep us the Druzhba pipeline, but cut off everything else. So this is the costs that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about sanctions, not just about economics.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So let's do quickly. I'm gonna start just. Okay, so let me do very quickly. I wanted to show you something on revenues as well. A lot of people talk about.
Just because I saw you mentioned Iran. If the US makes a deal with Iran, it would help a lot just to bring the price down, and this will bring Russia into difficulties as well, or not?
It would help definitely. I think Iran will definitely. Iran, Venezuela, we're back to that. So US, for example, picked up a lot imports from Russia exactly at the time when Venezuela and Iran were taken out of the market. And that's why at some point Russia was supplying 8% of oil to US. And actually a lot of refineries are still focused on that, but not anymore. But so you could try to do the reverse, but then you're having a very complicated negotiation with Iran. As you remember, Iran was first put in, I think, 2012, 15. Then you had the deal in 15, and then US walked out on it in 18. So every time there is this uncertainty about the sanctions, big business is less likely to come back. And 18 was a huge slap back to especially a lot of European businesses that said, wait a second, we trusted you, we went back even timidly, and we got this surprise, we're not going to touch it again. So therefore, the ability of people to come back and help Iran develop their oil and export, it's going to be very also. First part, negotiation between the governments. Second part, to convince the business that this time it's safe to come back. We have elections in a couple of years in the US.
And what's the capacity of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East to expand their production capacity quickly?
So Saudi is one of those, what I understand is one of those swing producers. So they have extraordinary, I think out of OPEC in general, I think they're one of those that actually have a lot of swing production capacity. But the issue here, since it's all geopolitical and Russians have been on it, Russia has worked OPEC project as a geopolitical project. So when Russia started doing the OPEC plus, it did not need oil for break-even prices. It was very good on their, so actually, by the way, sort of here, we have it here on the budget revenues, you know, it was after 14, we managed to reduce dependence even on oil and gas for our federal budget. Our break-even budget was $40-ish per barrel, right? Balance of payments even more potentially comfortable. So at that stage, actually, Saudi and others were more uncomfortable because their fiscal oil break-evens were much higher. So this is where Russia came and said, okay, we can work together. I want geopolitics from you. I have money. I have contribution from oil. And that's why now Saudi and OPEC Plus is sitting relatively quietly. We haven't seen any big announcements. We're going to push ahead and supply as much needed, very quietly. So it's very possible that they will say, no, thank you very much. Just like China on a different scale.
Yes.
So yeah, so very quickly we have, let me show you the oil and gas revenues for the budget. All of us remember, let's look at the left-hand side, all of us remember about gas. But again, share of gas revenues is here. Share of oil revenues is here. This is in the federal budget. So the way that taxation works in Russia, a big bulk of extraction is taxed and also a big share of, and exports are also taxed. But the way that taxation is centralized, that the money flows to the balance of payments for oil and to the budget. The money flows for gas to balance of payments, a bit smaller and much smaller to the budget. Because to my understanding that Gazprom is always more used for domestic investment, for domestic subsidies, for some geopolitical projects. It paid its dues to the Russian corporated in different ways that oil did. Oil paid was natural money. So there is an exponential taxation, just a little bit over $25. It goes up. And basically all of the profit, almost 60 to 70% of profits, is taken by the budget. That's why also Russian oil production break-evens are so low, because they've been working for this for, I think, since 2000s, early, late 90s.
But are you saying that, you know, if you make a partial embargo on oil, and what happens is that Russia will deliver less barrels or fewer barrels of oil, but at a higher price, it won't, the oil price might go up, and then it doesn't help us at all, in a sense. Precisely.
So if you look at the budget very quickly, and here this is a little bit of was my colleague monkey calculations, very simplistic calculations on the implieds. And what we did, we had ruble price at 75 and ruble at 150, because remember, revenues in rubles, right? They get converted into rubles. Expenditures fixed in nominal terms. Well, until the budget is changed. But so, and then we have sort of the Brent price. And here we assume that the current discount of 25 will continue, just for simplicity. You see what happens with even the decline of volume, they still potentially get money on the budget. This is percent of 2021 GDP.
And that's also very important for the military. The budget is very important for the military.
Yes, the budget is very important for the military. And we do have, yes, exactly. It's here. We have national economy, we have national defense, other services. They also have a chunk of the expenditure that is hidden expenditure. So ever since the sanctions, Russia started using hidden expenditure. We used to be 1 or 2 percentage points, very small. Then it went to 5, 9, 13, 10. And but we do not know what it is. So officially, Russia reports a number on how much it spends on the military. Unofficially, I really don't know. The only sort of saving grace here is there are domestically, it's a semi-oligopolic market. So if Russia is corrupt everywhere else, chances are it's also very corrupt there. So the fact that they spend more doesn't mean necessarily they get better products or they get better contracts, right? So just like we know with the Olympics, which cost $40 billion, I think. You know, it's so it's potential that, you know, the spending that we see in the budget hidden or official, it's maybe actually not being spent very effectively.
So Marius has a question essentially, how important is it that Vitol, the largest global oil trader, will stop trading Russian oil by the end of the year? Is this important?
This is extremely important because I think 3 or 4 top companies that foreign companies that operate in Russia, they do maintenance of all the fields. So they do a lot of, they've worked in Russia for decades, since the 90s, and they've always had a very close relationship. They had to, because otherwise you couldn't work in Russia with the government and with these companies. And a lot of these companies fully rely on them. So even for the existing fields, you will have a problem. And for the new fields, there is no question. So I don't know, either LNG or the new Russian oil fields, they will not be able to develop without the technology. Even the 2014, there were minor sanctions on the energy technology. Even those were beginning to bite, and now these ones will bite even more. So we do think that the announcement, I think, by Novak, Russian energy minister, that they're going to drop by 4-5% this year, I think it's nonsense. As is, they will drop by 10-20% this year in terms of output, just because they will not be able to do without foreign companies. And the problem for some of the Russian fields is that once you close them, you won't be able to reopen them. So we are potentially losing this production permanently. And that's also where Russia sort of feels the pinch, because it's not only just about financing, it's a risk of losing your production altogether.
But that would argue for a cold turkey approach, in a sense that they have to shut down their field and they can't open it up again. Or do I see it incorrectly?
That is with the corresponding costs for the European economy, and still you need to have smart carve-outs. So we find substitutes for places like Ukraine. If you call the cold turkey a prepared approach, yes.
So, but this is about oil or about gas? So once you close down the well, you can't open it up and again. That's for both oil and gas? Or
so what I understand is more for oil than for gas. For gas, it's the new developments. The LNG from Russia, and there's one chart actually here on LNG. You see how much Russia has also been supplying on the LNG market, you see? Mm-hmm. It's very important. Novatek, little semi-private company, you know, not the government, managed to make its space here. It has some good projects. It's actually international projects as well, you know, I think half owned by foreigners, and did great work. But now without foreigners, they will not be able to do that. Again, there is a long conversation on gas. What you want to keep on the long contracts, which are cheaper, versus the short-term contracts, spot contracts, which are killing Europe at the moment, and especially if you go cold turkey. And we can have a separate seminar on that.
But in generally, this technology sanctions, you would say they're very important, not only in particular for, you know, being able to extract more gas and oil, but also, let's say that for the Airbuses, you don't give them spare parts anymore. Is this really important too? I would say technology with respect to the oil and the gas and energy industry is way more important rather than the...
It is important across the board. And then there is one of the researchers, Zubarevich, she's been working on the economic geography of Russia. And I've been really focused on her work recently, especially recently, is that if you go through the map of Russia, almost everywhere, steel, you know, car manufacturing, Kaluga, St. Petersburg, this and that, you need to have foreign parts. And we were trying to talk with my colleague, an economist, the other day. Oh, well, Russians like KAMAZ. Can we do KAMAZ? No, we cannot do KAMAZ, foreign parts. Lada, can we do Lada? No, we cannot do Lada, foreign parts. So almost everywhere in car manufacturing, in processing, in steel, in oil and gas, you will be hitting these constraints. And that's why I think sanctions are also having an effect, is because, majority of their I wouldn't take a flight in Russia, what I'm trying to say anymore. So give it another month, I would not fly anywhere, because you don't have the parts, right? You will not be able to repair those planes. The same thing for fast trains, you know, you cannot, you know, they will, so things will last as long they might last, but then that's it. You're not going to have new parts, and to circumvent sanctions and bring them in bulk via Kazakhstan, or it will be very tricky. It's unlikely people will do that. Question is whether China, with the foreign direct, what is it called? I think there is one of those export rules by the US, where the product is not produced in the US, is not produced by US company, but has enough of the US component, either technology or software, it's still under export controls. The question is whether China will try to circumvent or not. I don't think so, but you know, that's a big question.
You mentioned Kazakhstan and you know, the other Asian countries. They're very dependent in terms of transport on Russia, and can there be of any help, or they are more on the Russian side anyway? So that's...
What you might remember, just before the war on Ukraine, there was a little change sort of in Kazakhstan and Russian dominated, sort of a small former Soviet Union's abridged NATO version participated in that peacekeeping mission. So there is clearly their own power dynamics. It was interesting to see that China kept out of it, although China has a lot of interest in Kazakhstan, and in business, China and Russia, there is a bit of competition. No, I think they're not like Belarus, of course, but they still have enough links with Russia that I think their alliances are between Russia and China rather than the West.
Very good. Do you have two more slides, and then we have to come to an end?
Okay, let's do 2 more slides. So this is what we talked a little bit more about China and India in terms of what the substitution can be. This is how much in volumes. So this is how much Europe takes from Russia. And this is where China currently buys their oil, and this is where India buys their oil. And as you see, Russia is not even there, I think, because it's too small. Oh, no, it is there. It is there. Of course, it is there. Look, it's very small. So you would have to change all this, take this bar and drop it somewhere here. India doesn't have enough refining capacity even to do that. Here, China would have to depend fully on Russia for their oil supplies. It's even for China itself, it might be a question. And then, of course, we discussed already the transportation issue. So let me just see one last slide, easy, which can be another couple of seminars, is don't forget Russia doesn't only export oil and gas. So we do have a number of markets where Russia could try to do counter-sanctions. And we already see that the prices have moved significantly, particularly to some of the places where Russia has dominance. Russia, but of course, Belarus and Ukraine. And it's also Ukraine's story. So Russia has not been effective in counter-sanctions, hasn't really thought about counter-sanctions, probably because they always thought that we're not going to be effective anyway. But if we're going to this stage of war, they might decide to do so. The only thinking I have here is that, look, if you're losing a bulk of your oil or gas revenues on the balance of payments, why kill it completely by also killing your metals, right? But you could start having the nuance. As you can see, palladium is important. I think titanium is hard to break out. Aluminum, we already know about the food problems, fertilizers and the foods also from Ukraine and the harvest. So that's something that for the next seminar.
So how much influence does Russia have over some countries in Africa, which also provides some of this supplies or commodities?
So Russia has been going into MENA and China and Iran and somewhat less to Africa. It has had some relationship with Russia. What Russia's projection of power is oftentimes in countries like this is arms deals. So a big chunk of other exports in Russia is arms, like India relies on the tanks on Russia and other hardware. Then in MENA, a lot of bias as well, and in Africa as well. And then also their nuclear plants. So ironically, Chernobyl notwithstanding, Russia is one of the sort of very competitive providers of this technology. And it competes, I think, with the US, with France in this. And for example, in Egypt, I think it's doing a big project. So South Africa was trying to do a big project. So that's one of the areas where definitely I have a lot of influence.
So let me come back to one more question which came up about the gold itself. So it seems like Russia bought a lot of gold from Sudan through some illegal means and smuggling. So, but if you were to want to use this gold, I asked you earlier, you can just ship it. There's no hindrance in terms of shipping it to pay for certain things.
So there are already sanctions on Russian central bank's ability to use gold. Mm-hmm. So you would have to circumvent sanctions. How fungible the bricks of gold are, we can discuss. I know that Iran via Turkey tried to do that and was semi-successful for a while. And I think there was even either it's Iran's or North Korean's planes was full of gold. I think it was Iran was arrested somewhere. And of course, there was this big sanctions debate was Turkish banks. And if you look at the Turkish current account, the balance of payments, you always had errors and omissions, and they were always positive and somehow helping to patch up Turkish current account. And I think a lot of that was circumvention of sanctions from Iran, but for a while. So I think OFAC and others have gotten more smarter in terms of monitoring it and tracking it. So yes, this is something that you can do, try to use it physically, but it's also not very practical. it's probably easier to swap it somehow and use that if you need to have foreign exchange. But at the moment, we do have a funny situation where the central bank cannot really accumulate reserves because of sanctions, but at the same time, they're having a wall of effects. So what might see is them liberalizing a little bit for domestic residents, their capital controls.
So let's conclude with, if you were all powerful and you could design the whole sanctions for Europe and the US and the rest of the world, coming back what you started out from, essentially, how would you design it? And do you have a particular advice? If you can pick one, thing, you can really change some policymakers' perspective, what would you pick?
Well, there are different things. What would I pick, and also how to change policymakers' perspective. So what I pick is escrow accounts and start with oil products. And then, of course, work it up to oil taxation in a smart way, or tariffs, and then gas. But sort of do what you can do now, and it will be already impactful. How I can convince the authorities that European energy security will have a price for the rest of times, right? It will, and people in Europe didn't have to think about that. So it's no longer will be the most efficient. It will have to incorporate the price. So the ideal world, I would have some sort of burden sharing between the US and Europe, moving away from energy altogether. Because otherwise Europeans might say, wait a second, we're going to make this huge hit. Russia, quote unquote, has been our reliable supplier since the Soviet times. We're going to have a scenario where in the US there is somebody else coming to the elections, or somebody who has been already elected before, who will say we're out of NATO and we're not interested in supplying LNG to Europe. And what do we do? Good.
So I forgot one question I would like to throw in at the end. I apologize for that. It's about all the crypto aspects.
Oh, yes. Very good question. So Russia is very important in mining. Russia is also important at using them for sort of a like kind of dark web and basically criminal activity and corruption. So they use that. There's been spikes on some of the crypto assets around the conflict, Ukraine and Russia, and also actually Turkey, partially because of their problematic monetary policy. But the volumes are just not big enough to help circumvent sanctions. I want to do more research on that. So if anybody has advice, please do send us. I know that US Treasury is also focused on it. They do make technically no distinction between the two, but there has always been the concern. What I do find is interesting is how swift dynamic will change with the CBDCs and crypto assets. I think that is where Europe also potentially has a chance in terms of the even higher role of Europe. We talk about the role of Euro and we say, well, it's second. Well, wait a second. It is second. It's only 20 years on and it's second. It's huge, right? So I think that's where I think the action is more than looking into Russia's ability, at least in the short term, to circumvent sanctions this way. Because at the end of the day, you need to cash in. You need to be known once you go into the mainstream economy.
Thanks a lot, Elina. It was really illuminating. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody learned a lot as well. And we stay in touch, and I hope you can enlighten me. I guess we learn more about all the events unfolding. We live in fast-moving times, and hope to talk to you soon. And thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes.